please bring comfort to those who are sick, especially those who are studying and sick, so that they can it'd be easier for them to concentrate during the day. And watch over the rest of us who have been sick or aren't sick yet, especially with this cold season coming up. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you very much, Lord. Amen.
Amen. The book of Job, we've got quite a few. As you know, God allows Satan to test Job. Now, it's not because Job sinned, but God allows it because he has such confidence that Job is a true believer, a God-fearing man. And so Satan, in turn, tests Job. First of all, removes his possessions, then his family, and then lastly, he attacks Job himself. And then his three friends come to comfort him, help him, and they start off well with 7 days in which they just sit with him in his suffering. And then, in typical fashion, they offer pastoral care. Now, the theology they use is not wrong. They use the right theology, but in the wrong situation, because they assume that Job has sinned. No, they make the wrong assumption. And so they join with Satan in accusing Job. They think they're siding with God, giving the right theological explanation, but in fact they're siding with Satan. You get a cycle, 3 cycles of debates between Job and his friends, in which they try to bring Job to his senses. Finally, the debate is silenced. And then Job turns to God and decides to force God's hand. And he does so by doing 4 things, and you need to see the way they work. First of all, he takes an oath of clearance. Basically, he says that I am innocent. And what I say is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, in effect. That's the way we'd put it in modern terms. Then he couples that with a curse on the wicked one. Now, if he is guilty, then who will the curse fall on? Him, right? Can you see that? And God will have to act to bring the curse on Job. Then he follows this with a complaint about the injustice of his suffering. I'll have more to say about that complaint element. There's a bit of a problem there. And then he takes a second oath, which is an oath of clearance. He thinks about all the possible things that he could have done wrong, and he says, in effect, God, if I've done this, then judge me. Then bring the consequences on me. Now, if he is guilty, what will God have to do?
Punish him.
Punish him. But if he's innocent, then God will have to do what?
Contradict himself, because then God would be guilty.
Then God would be guilty, and he'd have to vindicate Job and end Job's suffering. So he tries to force God's hand. And that's where we are then. And between Job's oath of clearance, which you can look up for yourself, and God's appearance, you get a very clumsy attempt by a young theologian. He's a theological student. He's learnt his dogmatics well, Elihu, who tries to do justice both to God and to Job. He tries to justify God's actions and he tries to justify Job, but it's a typical con job because it misses the point. God doesn't need to be defended, on the one hand. Job doesn't need an explanation. What does he need?
He He wants
What does Job need in his suffering?
comfort.
He needs not words of comfort. What?
Forgiveness?
He hasn't sinned.
A reason. Why is he...
Does Job want a reason?
Just listening.
What does he want? What does he need? He's suffering. What do you want?
Care.
Deliverance. Right? Vindication. He wants an end to suffering. Don't miss the obvious. That's what he wants. Now, okay. Now, that's what you need to know when you're ministering to people. Pastoral care. You think people need explanations about what's happening. People don't need explanations. They will raise those issues, but they need help in their suffering and deliverance from their suffering. Okay, and then the unexpected happens. God appears. And he appears to answer, in his previous complaints, Job had accused God of two things. One, of injustice, and secondly, of incompetence. Incompetence, because if God is wise, then he doesn't act wisely in dealing with Job and with suffering people like Job. Or on the other hand, the other possibility is that God is not interested in justice, and hence he condones injustice. So the two charges against God are incompetence and injustice. And God does something very interesting. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't attack Job. He doesn't declare Job guilty. But instead, he challenges Job to prove to prove to him that he is not wise or that he is incompetent. So it basically says, okay, you've accused me of a lack of wisdom and incompetence. Okay, show me. Prove to me that I am. So first of all, God challenges Job to prove his wisdom, or the opposite of a lack of wisdom, and then he challenges Job to prove his lack of justice. And in each case then, Job withdraws the charges. Let's just have a look at the two main points there. First of all, 38, 1 to 11. Tony, could you start reading that? Could you read that? 38, 1 to 11. Yes?
Just a question. Elihu, was he not one of the friends, and he's the guy who walked up and started talking?
Yeah, he's a fourth acquaintance.
And so God actually physically appears, or
God appears. He answers from a storm. It's very mysterious. He answers Job's lament from a storm. 38, 1 to 11, you get all that we know is that he starts talking to Job, and this is what he says.
Then the Lord answered Job out of a storm. He said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge?"
Now, darkens my counsel. God's counsel is his strategy, his policy, his plan for running the world. And he so accuses Job of ignorance of God's plans.
"Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Who shut up the seas behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garments and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed its limits for it and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, this far you may come and no further? Here is where your proud waves halt."
Now, what God does is takes Job, if you like, on a journey across the whole of creation. and says, okay, parades creation before you. He said, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? If you reckon that I bungled the running of the world, show me where I've gone wrong. And starting off with creation, he takes them over the whole of the world, including the wild animals, and says to him, show me where I've gone wrong. Show me where I've bungled. Show me where I'm incompetent in managing the world. And then you get Job's retraction. 43-5, please, Tony.
Sorry?
Chapter 43-5, you get his retraction of his charge that God is lacks in wisdom.
Chapter
40, 3-5.
Sorry. Then Job answered the Lord, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer.
Unworthy is wrong. The Hebrew is I'm too little. Now, it says, okay, yes, I get the picture. I don't understand the way you run the world. I take back what I said. Okay, now comes the next charge. Remember, the first charge is that God is incompetent in the way he manages the world. The second charge that Job has made against God, that God is indifferent to injustice, that he rules the world unjustly. Stephen, can you get the first part of God's appearance, chapter 40, verse 6 through to 14.
Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself?
Just stop there. Notice the would you do what? Discredit my justice in order to justify yourself. That's the problem. And then God says, okay, you've charged me with injustice in effect, okay, let me see if you can do better. Go on, Stephen.
Do you have an arm like God's, and can your voice thunder like his? Then adorn yourself with glory and splendour, and clothe yourself in honour and majesty. Unleash the fury of your wrath. Look at every proud man and bring him low. Look at every proud man and humble him. Crush the wicked where they stand. Bury them all in the dust together. Shroud their faces in the grave. Then I myself will admit to you that your own right hand can save you.
Okay, now, what God in effect does says, okay, you've accused me of acting unjustly. Okay, let's see what you would do. I'll give you all my power. Now, what are you going to do about the problem of evildoers? Just think, okay, if you had God's power, what would you do about all the creeps, the evildoers in the world?
Smiting, great smiting.
Indeed, and I can see you relish it with great relishment.
That was awesome.
Sorry?
That was awesome.
Okay, you better write that down. Okay, and then God, in effect, says, okay, runs past him two chaos monsters. There's Behemoth and Leviathan. Now, this is mythological language. Now, chaos monsters, they represent chaos in creation. Now, what God does, he doesn't eliminate evil. He doesn't eliminate chaos, but what does he do in his wisdom? If God was truly just, now God is just, but if his justice meant destroying everything that was evil and chaotic, what would happen?
We're stuffed.
The whole world would cease to exist. No human being would cease to exist. But then God uses the example of Leviathan and Behemoth, chaos monsters, whom he tames and domesticates and turns into tameable creatures. He manages, he controls. So he doesn't eliminate evil, but he does something far more wonderful. He brings good out of evil and order out of chaos. The result is that Job retracts his charges of injustice. And then something strange happens. Can we go to chapter 42, 7 to 10, please, Dylan? 42, 7 to 10.
After the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz and Temanite, I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has.
Just pause there. You have not spoken right of me. Now you've got to be kidding, because Eliphaz and his three friends are absolutely orthodox in their theology. They, dogmatically speaking, are totally correct. And yet God does what? He says, you have not spoken right of me. Dylan, can you work out what God is getting at here? What is the wrong that they've spoken of God?
Well, they assumed that God had judged Job when he hadn't, I suppose.
Yes, that he was judging Job for his sin.
Even though he hadn't done anything.
And therefore using their theology to damn an innocent person. Speaking for God in a way that's not appropriate in that situation. Now this is amazing, because if you've read the book of Job, you know that Job says some horrible things about God. He says God's a monster who wants to kill me. God's using me for target practice. Very angry things. And yet at the end, God doesn't accuse Job of speaking wrongly about him. Who does he accuse of speaking wrongly about him? His three friends. Keep going, Dylan.
So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz and Temanite, Bildad and the
Shuhite, yes.
And Zophar the
Naamathite
did what the Lord told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. Is there another verse?
Just verse 10 too.
After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord made him prosperous again and gave him twice as much as he had before.
Now, that's the climax of the book. And the book ends in a strange way. If I can summarize the whole movement in the book starts off with Job as a man of justice, who advocates for people and administers God's justice on earth. He's a God-fearing, just person who's interested in administering God's justice. As a result of his suffering, God does something wonderful to him and turns him from a judge, if you like, an advocate of justice, into what?
Intercessor.
An intercessor. And as an intercessor, who has access to God, he uses his access to God to claim grace and forgiveness for others. And you get the case of his three friends. The tables are turned. If I put it the other way around, what should his three friends have done when they came to comfort him? Interceded for him. Okay? But instead of interceded for him, they accuse him. And so they side with Satan. This book is the most wonderful book on pastoral care that I know. Yes?
Just wondering, was this after Moses or before Moses?
Well,
Well, I'm not really sure.
we're not. There's no dating. There's no dating to
I'd
it.
assume it would be before, just because it says he lived 140 years.
Yeah. Look. No, but we have no thing, and it's not. The book of Job is not history. It is wisdom. It's a story.
Okay, yeah.
It's a story, a drama.
Yeah.
dramatic story to make a point. And the important thing about it is that, it's probably set intentionally before the time of Abraham, not only before the time of Moses, before the time of Abraham, and it deals with people at all times and in all places. And also it has to do with wisdom. Now, what's Job's problem? If I can summarize this situation. As you see, the book is very complex and it's very profound, and I'm frustrated because I can do so little justice to what's all here. What's Job's problem? Okay, any Israelite who was a victim of injustice could always appeal to God against his enemies with an individual complaint. Remember that about the Psalms? If you were dealt with unjustly, you could go to God, the Supreme Court at the temple, and you could get justice from God. So, if you have an enemy who does injustice to you, you could appeal to God, who is your Goel, your Redeemer, your defender, your judge, and God will make sure that you had justice against your enemies. There are dozens of psalms in which people, the Israelites, do it. But what's Job's problem? Job's problem is that his enemy, his apparent enemy, is who? God. Okay? Since God was his apparent enemy, Job couldn't appeal to God to prove his innocence without putting God on the hot seat, as it were. While the book of Job has been influenced by the structure of individual complaints, it differs from them since God himself is Job's enemy. Now, Job's solution to this problem is twofold. And you need to get this in your head, and you've got the essence of the book. He appeals to his friends to act as his advocates with God. So, in his laments, he asks his friends to put in a word for him with God.
So they want to he asks them to intercede for him.
For him, in effect. But they become his enemies because they don't want to side with Job and God's judgment on Job. They want to side with the angels. They want to cover their own backsides by siding with God. But in fact, by doing so, they become Job's enemies. When they fail him, Job turns to God and he challenges God to act with this. By declaring that he's innocent, by bringing a curse on anyone who's wicked, and if he is untrue, then it comes on him. He complains about the injustice that he suffered, and then he takes an oath of clearance. Now, this puts God on the horns of a dilemma. Can you see it? If God doesn't act, then it proves that
God's unjust and uncaring.
Yeah, then it proves that God's... Yeah. If he does act, then it proves that Job is guilty. So either you can see either God's guilty or Job's guilty. But what's the situation?
Neither.
Both God and Job are innocent. So God must reveal Job's innocence or guilt by either punishing him or restoring his prosperity. This puts God on the spot, as it assumes that either God or Job is guilty. If God fails to punish Job, God in effect admits his guilt and his injustice, his incompetence. By his appearance, God vindicates both himself and Job. Very profound book. We're running behind schedule, so I've got to work fairly quickly. What are the main theological themes? First of all, and this is very important, the suffering of the righteous, innocent suffering, is not an indication of sin, but it's a test and vindication of spiritual integrity. Okay? God allows Job to suffer to test his faith and to prove his integrity. to show that he is a man of God. Job, however, doesn't know this. That's the problem. He doesn't know what's God doing until the very end. At the end he sees what God's doing, but he doesn't see what God's doing at the beginning. What does Job in his suffering demand from God? Well, let's have a look at chapter 13 through to 23. Please, Garth. Job 13 through to 23. And this marks one of those points where Job turns from his friends and challenges God. Job 13 through to 23.
Keep silent and let me speak. Then let come to me what may. Why do I put myself in jeopardy and take my life in my hands? Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face. Indeed, this will turn out for my deliverance. For no godless man would dare come before him. Listen carefully to my words. Let your ears take in what I say. Now that I have prepared my case, I know I will be vindicated. Can anyone bring charges against me? If so, I will be silent and die.
Now, up to this point, he's talking to his friends. He tells them to shut up because he's going to take his life in his hands. He's going to assert his innocence before God. And this is his prayer to God.
Grant me these two things, O God, and then I will not hide from you. Withdraw your hand far from me, and stop frightening me with your terrors.
Up to verse 23.
Then summon me and I will answer, or let me speak and you reply. How many wrongs and sins have I committed? Show me my offences and my sins.
Right, there's two things that Job demands of God. One is that God lays off and just gives him some space. And secondly, he demands of God that God shows him where he's sinned and gone wrong. Now, that's the only thing he wants from God. He doesn't demand his vindication. He demands that if he's sinned, God shows him his sin. That's what he wants from God. Can you see? And that's quite reasonable. What's the problem?
He hasn't sinned.
He hasn't sinned. So that puts God in an awkward spot. What God wants then is justice from God in the face of his hostility. Now, there's three other points there that you can work out for yourself that follow from this. Because of his own suffering, Job doesn't just despair of God's justice, but he despairs about God's management of the whole of the world. That God doesn't just act unjustly with Job, but he's acting unjustly in his management of the world. You can see his own injustice opens his eyes to injustice everywhere. All of us experience that. And it's quite reasonable. But then there's also another thing, that as a result of Job's suffering, God opens his eyes to human suffering everywhere. God sensitizes him to the suffering of all the little people, the hurts everywhere in the world. And there's a most moving passage where Job expresses his awareness of the suffering and pain of people all around him. Read it for yourself. Wonderful passage. And then he, talking to his friends, he expresses the fact that what he wants, what a person like him wants from other human beings in their sufferings, is solidarity in suffering. Not explanations, not justifications, not answers, but solidarity. He wants them to stay with him, to look at him, and particularly to listen to him. He just wants them to listen to him and then to act on what they hear. Then come his demand, and these three passages are the three most important passages in the book of Job that you need to be aware of. Note well about these three passages, very important for the New Testament and for Christian theology. What Job demands is given in Jesus. There's the clue. Okay, David, take the first one.
Hand it over to Levi.
Oh, Levi, you have the privilege of reading this. Chapter 9, 33 to 35. This is what Job wants.
If only there was someone to arbitrate between us, to lay his hands upon us both, someone to remove God's rod from me, so that his terror would frighten me no more. Then I would speak up without fear of him, but as it now stands with me, I cannot.
Okay, Levi, you see David getting stuck into Joshua.
Yep.
Okay, and what has to happen before you can sort out the problem is that you've got to separate them. You've got to have a mediator who intervenes. Now, Job wants somebody to intervene to get God off his back so that he can speak to God and he can get a clear solution from God. So he wants a mediator. Okay, what kind of mediator? That's explained further in the next remarkable passage, chapter 16, verse 18 following. You're probably familiar with this wonderful passage. Okay, could you read 2 again, Levi?
O earth, do not cover my blood. May my cry never be laid to rest. Even now my witness is in heaven. My advocate is on high. My intercessor is my friend. As my eyes pour out tears to God, on behalf of a man, he pleads with God, as a man pleads for his friend.
Now, Job assumes that he's going to die and that he won't get justice here on earth, and he won't get somebody who can mediate between him and God here on earth, like his friends. And so he expresses a wish or his hope that even now, already now, that he has a witness, an advocate, a friend up in heaven who will stand between God, who is angry with him, and Job, and will mediate between them. The way a man, look at the last one, the way a man pleads for his friends, for his friend. So a mediator between God's wrath, the angry God, the God who seems to be judging him, and Job. Right? Notice those terms: a witness, heavenly witness, advocate, intercessor, one who pleads with God on behalf of another. The last passage, chapter 19, 23, following. Levi, could you read that too? Now he assumes that he's going to die. Just pick up, however, to get some flavour of this context, the context here. First of all, read verse 13 through to 22.
Okay.
This he here is God, so just say God, beginning of 13.
God has alienated my brothers from me. My acquaintances are completely estranged from me. My kinsmen are gone away. My friends have forgotten me. My guests and my maidservants count me a stranger. They look upon me as an alien. I summon my servant, but he does not answer, though I beg him with my own mouth. My breath is offensive to my wife. I am loathsome to my own brothers. Even the little boys scorn me. When I appear, they ridicule me. All my intimate friends detest me. Those I love have turned against me. I am nothing but skin and bones. I have escaped with only the skin of my teeth. Have pity on me, my friends. Have pity, for the hand of God has struck me. Why do you pursue me as God does? Will you never get enough of my flesh?
To get the basic picture, he's alienated, isolated from all human beings. And there's one thing that he asks of his three friends is that they have pity on him. And it's in this context then he makes this confession of faith, this wish and this confession of faith. So first of all, the wish. Verse 23, 24, Levi?
Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead, or engraved in rock forever.
The words that he once inscribed are his declaration of innocence. I am innocent. I have not sinned. And he wants them, well, first of all, he says written on a scroll, but that's not good enough because you can burn a scroll. He wants it inscribed on lead. What's the feature of lead as a metal? It doesn't erode. Or even better than lead, engraved on rock with iron tool. That'll last forever. So he wants these words of his, both his declaration of innocence and the following confession of faith that he makes. He wants this engraved so that it bears witness to him forever. Now, what is his confession of faith, his hope?
I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me.
Now this is the yearning of Job's heart, which is the yearning of, if you like, of every human being who's ever experienced injustice. Is that even if Job doesn't get justice in this life, he will get justice in eternity. And that there will be someone who can redeem him. Now the Redeemer in ancient Israel was the oldest male in your family who would stick up for you and care for you and look after you. We'll come to the Redeemer later on this morning when we look at the book of Job. Job says, Ruth, yes, sorry. I know that my Redeemer lives. Somebody who can stick up for me and vindicate me and make sure that I get justice, if not in time, then in eternity. And as a result of that, then I will be able to stand before God and see God face to face and receive God. What from God?
Redemption.
His redemption and his approval, his vindication. That God will say, welcome Job, you are innocent. That he will receive vindication for Job because somebody redeems him. Somebody sticks up for him. Somebody makes sure that he finally gets justice, if not on earth, then in heaven. The longing for the Redeemer. Then lastly, we have a wonderful poem about God's wisdom. Now, the poem makes the point that even though God's wisdom is at work everywhere in the world, our human problem is that we can't see it. It's hidden. And it works in a strange way. If I look at the world, does it look as if God's in charge? What I see is trouble, chaos, disorder. If I look at the world, does it look as if God is a God of justice?
Not really.
Not really. Now, this poem talks about the hidden justice of God, which is then revealed, if you like, in the last part of the world, of the book. In what way does God show his wisdom? What's the wisdom of God in dealing with evil and injustice? We would see wisdom in God eliminating evil, but what does God do?
Taming.
He not only tames it, it's better than that.
Good out of it.
He brings good out of evil. So the final word of God is not justice, but grace. And with that comes the change in Job. Job sees wisdom in terms of justice. Everybody getting what they deserve. But God changes him, converts him, transforms him so that instead of becoming a man of justice, being a man of justice, he becomes an a minister of God's grace. And how does he do that? by praying for others, by becoming an intercessor. And that then is the purpose of the book. The book of Job is a book of wisdom to help righteous people, innocent people, to cope with innocent sufferings. Now, what is God doing when you and I and the people you minister suffer innocently? It doesn't give an answer, but it helps you to make sense of it and to cope with it. Why? Because it shows how God uses suffering to turn a righteous person who'd been an agent of divine justice into an intercessor and an agent of divine grace for others. That's the point of the book. And that's the secret to pastoral care. When you minister to people who are in trouble, your job is not to preach at them. Even to teach them. Your job is to do what?
Walk with them.
That's still secular.
Okay.
Okay, listen to them, secular, but to pray what? To pray for them. And in that way, stand in for them before God and represent God to them by praying to them, bringing them and God's grace and help together. What they need is not human help, but divine help. And how can you bring divine power and help to people in their suffering? By interceding. Brothers, that's something that and sisters, that's something that's of great importance in the church and for you who will be working in the church. Yes.
I totally agree.
You totally do.
I do.
Watch out for the but then. Yes.
The book that we're reading, the way of the cross or whatever it was.
Spirituality of the cross, yes.
Spirituality of the
Gene Veith, yes.
It almost felt like it was sort of pushing aside interceding for people in pastoral care, and I was like, I disagree with that. It just, like, it was a great book, but it just seemed like it wanted to.
Yes. I don't think he would deny it. It's what he's arguing. It's a while since I've read it. What he's arguing against is inappropriate conclusions from that. And there's two sides to it. There's a difference between what happens in worship, where we do intercede, but we do other things besides intercede. So there's a difference between your work in the divine service and pastoral care. The job in the divine service, the fundamental task that a pastor does, is to be a minister of word and sacrament, and that's what he's interested in is taking that. Now, and it's not the job of a pastor to be an intercessor. Why?
You say it's not?
It's not the job. It's not the unique job of the pastor.
No. Everyone's supposed to be.
Every Christian is called to be a priest, and a priest means, as a go-between God and human beings, means being an intercessor. So that's the job of every Christian, but it doesn't mean it's not the job of a pastor as well. Pastor's still a Christian. Yes, I hope. Well, should be. Let's have a break. Please don't make it too long, because I want to get through 3 books, if I can, in the next hour.